if you have a homeless person at a homeless event, oh my gosh, people would feel uncomfortable.
Right.
Well, maybe they should feel uncomfortable. What they're saying may be disruptive, but we have to disrupt what we're doing because it's not working.
Generally within this sector have come up with a definition of success at the expense of the ordinary story. I never fully appreciated at the time the power dynamic that went into those of us working in the field who controlled access to a bunch of resources being the ones who asked the questions, compared to when we got someone with lived experience to go talk to people with living experience. Much deeper engagement. We really have to figure out even context of engagement. We do have to figure out ways of also not equating one person's experience to all people's experiences, how people's voice is shared, and what they want to say.
Iain's back, and we are talking about the lived experience of homelessness. If you're not connected to the homeless sector, that's just a fancy way of saying homeless or formerly homeless people. Over the last couple of years, lived experience of homelessness has become a very popular conversation, but it's still mostly tokenism. We got to get to where we're not just listening to homeless people, but empowering them to make decisions that affect their own lives. This is a very candid conversation. I think you're gonna like it. As we're going, I'm replaying it in my head, and it's kind of a separate topic. So it's good that we're going to take the time to unpack this.
And our topic is,
And I'm blaming you
as you should.
because you did a video on this.
Yes, I did.
Iain has a YouTube channel.
I do. So inspired by so much of the great work that Mark is doing with Invisible People.
Oh, I'm honored.
I decided that probably the best medium to be able to reach people these days isn't an antiquated blog. I used to be a blogger, but to take some of the same energy and insights that I used to put into the blog and start putting it on YouTube. So at Org Code Consulting is the YouTube channel, and rants and commentary and research summaries and micro trainings.
So lived experience is sexy.
Well, it's all the rage in some circles.
I am nervous about this one because as we're driving down here, I said, eventually you're going to get me in trouble.
Yes.
But really, I'm just going to get myself in trouble and blame you.
Okay. You wouldn't be the first person to blame me for something that they have done.
No. I mean, this is it's probably not any more touchy than the housing first that we just covered. But you did a video on lived experience. I, as a formerly homeless person, have some very strong opinions on this. I've worked with a lot of organizations developing lived experience programming, if you would, or committees, and I'm sure you have too. Mm-hmm. Some really good, some just, wow, what are these people thinking? Your video put in my mind, it's something we should do a podcast about. You know, when I started Invisible People, it was a couple of things. Is the general public had no connection to homeless people.
Right.
I mean, no positive connection. They would see a homeless person flying a sign in an exit ramp and immediately judge them to be a drug addict, a criminal, whatever. So I thought it was very important by putting up stories of homeless people that people would be able to relate to homeless people.
Right.
But there was also service providers, politicians, also did not have any direct connection with the people they're making decisions about.
Right.
Then what was it, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? Lived experience became the sexy thing. You had webinars and conference sessions. And here we are several years later, and I know of a couple of lived experience committees or communities that have engaged very positive, but most of them are still tokenism.
Yeah, I think a lot are still in the realm of tokenism. A lot are exploitive. almost, in terms of they want some gravitas to be able to say we engage with people with lived experience, but the roles that they gave people or the way that the information was filtered wasn't necessarily sincere or accurate at the end of the day. Or I think the other thing that we're seeing a lot of, Mark, is we are asking people with lived experience to take on the burden of failures in our system and tell us how to unscrew them up without providing a whole bunch of context, history, understanding, supports, guardrails, trauma therapies, etc.
Yeah.
So I think that's happening. And the other thing that I think is happening kind of at the same time that we're bringing in people with lived or living experience, and I do make a distinction between those two. Yeah. Lived as it happened is done, living as I'm still in it.
You used that for the first time that I heard in the video, and I liked it.
Because I think there's a distinction there too, because as people work after their experience of homelessness and find ways of living that are meaningful and reconnecting and those sorts of things, perspective is very different than when you're in the throes of where am I going to sleep tonight, what am I going to eat? And both are valuable, but they're very different. Yeah. But the other thing that's kind of happening here that we're not really talking about, there are many people I know in this sector who are survivors of things that are felt daily, but spoken about never. I think that our sector actually recruits, attracts a whole bunch of volunteers and staff who have experienced housing instability, who have experienced issues that often come with housing instability. But they don't lead with lived experience. They don't want to discuss their lived experience. It would be re-traumatizing for them to go through the process of even saying, I stayed in a shelter, or, you know what, I stayed on this person's couch or floor and I hardly knew them, or guess what, I slept with someone so I would have a place to stay, or whatever. Like those sorts of things people don't want to talk about out loud because it's traumatizing. And so I think that there actually is, in my experience, more lived experience than we give credit for, but they're not leading with it. And therefore, we nullify that voice. And we celebrate those who are often pressured to live their trauma out loud. Yeah. And by living their trauma out loud, I don't even think we're getting an empathetic response in most instances. Yeah. We're getting tokenist sympathetic responses. We're throwing around phrases like survivor for people in those places, but not talking about those who have survived and made their kind of career or didn't come back with lived or living experience. And we're being really selective in terms of who we want to be these voices, right? So if we only have like one spot on a board for a person with lived experience, and it's a 18-member board, I just made up a number because boards can be all different sizes, that's one of 18. And yet the other 17 board members at times might be say, so what do you think? And the pressures that come with being like, how am I supposed to represent everybody as a sample size of one must, in some instances, be enormous, but it's certainly distorting the reality for so many other people. I mean, my rambling to start here, there's some great aspects, but there's some parts that really concern me about lived experience.
So for those listening or watching, there's going to be rants here, but I promise you at some point we're going to give recommendations on how to engage lived experience programming so that it's positive for everybody involved.
Agreed. Thank you.
So you start off with something that just drives me crazy. Because the homeless sector, and I understand why they do this, they primarily want people that are in housing. And it's always the same people. People have heard me rant on Twitter or seen me rant on Twitter countless times that it's always the same 20 people. It's really about 10. They're on the webinars and on the stages and on the panels, and there's hundreds of thousands of homeless people and even more that are in housing. And I get it, because if you have a homeless person at a homeless event, oh my gosh, people would feel uncomfortable. Right. Well, maybe they should feel uncomfortable. So my friend Addie, who I hired to work the virtual reality at the last NEAH, is homeless. And I wish more vendors would hire people that are homeless. Why I bring up Addie is because none of the conferences bring in homeless people. So the National Law Office does. I think the National Healthcare does. But most of the conferences do not bring in homeless people. So Addie's first, when she was accepted on a scholarship, she was in housing, right? And she lost her housing, but was the first homeless person that went brought in because she lost her housing,
Right.
which is a no-no, right? And to your point, so people that are formerly homeless have an important voice because they can talk about retention. Because once you're in housing, that's a whole new set of challenges. And they can talk about that. But if you've been in housing 10 years, you can't talk about what's happening today in homelessness. And with the criminalization, it's different. It is different. So both voices are important, but we only feature one and we only feature a few of them because it's safe. I know that person. I know that person is going to show up. I know, and it can be done because I used to speak at tech conferences and bring homeless people on stage. And yeah, I would, okay, you got to pick them up early, make sure that they have a full stomach. You know, if you're doing a webinar, you got to make sure that they're close to Wi-Fi. You know, there's some challenges, but it's worth it. And I think both voices are important, but we only highlight 10 or 20 people.
I think there's reasons why.
Yeah.
I think we generally within this sector have come up with a definition of success that we like to promote at the expense of the ordinary story. Right? So instead of saying, here's Charlie, we got him housed, it was his third time, we're seeing promising changes this time. Charlie is still using, but he's using less, and he's still struggling with some money management, but with some supports, he's really improving. I mean, Charlie doesn't get his chance to tell his story, right? Because he's seen as still a work in progress. Instead, we want to tell the story of Jerome, who got housed, stayed housed,
Ta-da! A miracle.
is getting ready to buy a used truck, has visitation with his kids, is going to AA meetings, is participating in a Bible study, is getting a security certificate to work as a security guard, whatever. Like we say, Jerome's success. Oh, we want him as a person with lived experience on our board or on our advisory group or on our program design committee. But the first guy who's still struggling, we don't want him, right? And then we'll justify it and we'll say, because they're in two different places. And I will say, but both have validity, right? 20 years ago, when I was in a space of operating a large program, I couldn't fathom doing it without the voice of living experience. But what I found was, if I or one of my colleagues went out and talked to people and said, what do you want? How do you want it? When do you want it? Why do you want it? We would get very pat answers that were very protected. We would get a lot of the, it would be great if someone did A or B, but almost like an aw shucks. And I never fully appreciated at the time the power dynamic that went into those of us working in the field who controlled access to a bunch of resources being the ones who asked the questions. Like I really struggled with not understanding that to the full extent for quite a while. Compared to when we got someone with lived experience to go talk to people with living experience, and the person with lived experience had been out of homelessness for quite some time and was doing well and had a beautiful array of supports, both natural and professional in their life, so that they were well as they were doing the work with people with living experience. Much richer commentary, much deeper engagement, right? Not tokenistic. Told us all sorts of things we didn't want to hear, but also had great ideas on how to fix it. And it wasn't just like the you shalt or else sort of stuff. It was like there was an appreciation of how difficult it was to operate, a very large street outreach program and do better work in that space. And that really taught me so much around this experience. One, you're only going to do well if you have a good feedback loop, but that your feedback loop needs to be diverse, because here's what's happening, Mark. Our success stories are actually limiting the number of voices. We are controlling the number of influences. Two, If we had any other sort of study where we're looking for input, we would either want diverse voices, or if it was an academic study, probably look for some sort of representative sample. Sample sizes of 1, because we deemed you to be successful, are not going to be representative of the entirety of people served by a program. But we creating policies on those single voices. Some places we are essentially revamping investment strategies based upon that one voice. We sometimes are taking that small group of 10, as you described, and saying, okay, you redesign parts of our system, but we're not going to give you any training or supports to achieve that outcome. So you don't know like the context of where the funding comes from, or you don't know that, for example, housing and urban development says you can use the money for A, B, and C, but you can't use it for D, E, and F, right? And there is a technical part of the work of responding to homelessness that we either have to skill people up to get that, or we have to blend one skill set with the other.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody who we both know and work with about this, and looking at my own life, what made it different for me is, yes, I was homeless, but then I went and I worked as a case manager. I worked as a family case manager. I worked as an outreach case manager. So I saw the barriers and challenges that nonprofits have.
Yeah.
So I saw both sides. I don't know how to give that education to everybody. On the same topic, I think one thing that has happened that's really good is peer support, where outreach will go out with a peer support worker.
Yeah.
Now, when I tried to get a job in the homeless sector, they wouldn't hire me because I was once homeless, right?
Yeah.
Now, we'll hire you as a peer support. So peer support workers are going out with masters of social work. I've heard from peer support workers, they're frustrated because they're doing the work, basically. They know how to become a buddy or streetwise and, make connections with homeless people. Yet the masters of social work is getting paid because they went to college. So there's a disparity in revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So I immediately thought about this and I went, okay, well, service providers should help that peer worker go to college so that they could get the education so that their pay is more equal. Maybe there's other solutions.
Yeah, I think trained and supported is always a good idea. I think improving skills that people might have had but didn't have a theory to kind of ground it in is helpful. And I think peer supports really exist along a continuum, right? From the completely informal, I didn't ask you to be a peer, but guess what? You've been at the shelter for a while. Someone new showed up for the first time, and you decided to take them under your wing and show them the way around, right? So there's the informal stuff that is not necessarily needed to be trained or supported, nor necessarily compensated, right through to what you're describing, which is if I'm going to put you on a clinical team as a peer support worker, I better provide a level of compensation for what you're actually contributing to the team and the volume of work that you're doing for the team. And that's where I'll say, hey, in some of these instances, it's not just an education barrier. It's really it's a caste system within the sector. There's a level of social dynamic that exists that says, I am more worthy because of a higher education, as opposed to we have different worthiness because you went to the school of the streets and I went to such and such a school and got my degree.
You remember driving down, I mentioned that I'm nervous because I'm going to get in trouble.
Is it about to happen?
It's about to happen, probably.
Okay.
As you were saying, it's one of the issues that I hate the term lived expertise. It's a cute phrase that housed people with no experience of homelessness. Somebody said, they have lived expertise, and it's stuck. And they all said, one of my favorite things, not this NEH, but the NEH before, where they're starting to more facilitate groups of people with lived experience, and they revolted against it. They hated it. I mean, they even were trying to organize against it. And it's like, if you're going to call me an expert, then fucking pay me what you pay the consultants who you think are experts. I mean, just don't say a cute phrase. You know, if you're going to say I'm an expert, treat me as an expert. But they don't, right? And homeless people hate it.
Yeah,
But my one point on
Go
this,
ahead, go ahead.
because I think it's so important, and it is that they just picked this phrase and started using it without ever asking homeless people or formerly homeless people, what do you think of this?
Yeah, so this is one of those instances where I can draw a distinction between lived experience and lived expertise, right? And I actually do think both exist, but to your point, I think the expertise phrase has been applied en masse to some individuals for whom it is an inappropriate labeling. And I also think it's a term that has been adopted by some people with lived experience to elevate their profile because of their own ego or their own agenda. And I've seen that. And that last thing I said is probably going to get me in trouble. But I want to explain a little bit further. For those that have expertise, it tends to be, in my opinion, people that have been at the work of advocacy as someone who's used services for a period of time, who is not just self-interested, who is looking out for a broad range of a constituency or a population, not just people just like me, who know more about system dynamics, like how things are funded, how decisions are made politically, why some things don't get funded even though they're good ideas, and why some things that are bad ideas get funded, like understand the politics of this. Also, stay engaged with people who are experiencing homelessness and have really advanced programs and policy in the space. And I will say there's an expertise with that you are absolutely right, Mark, should be compensated at an appropriate level. That is, it's like you're a lived experience consultant, get paid a consultant wage or hourly for what it is that you're doing because you're offering something of value. But that is very different.
Yeah.
Very different than, oh, I would like you to talk about your experience of our services. Or I would like you to sit on our committee. Yeah. Especially in the second instance, we're not providing a lot of training. We're not providing a lot of support. We're not providing a lot of guidance. And then we're wondering why some people, like you described, are getting really angry that they're not being heard, they're not being seen, because the whole point wasn't to leverage anything that they really had of value. The whole point was to tick a box on an application saying we had a person with lived experience on our panel or our committee or our board.
Yeah. Oh, and before we go any farther, and I hope people are listening, if you're, this is so important because it's rarely talked about, is we put homeless people and formerly homeless people on pedestals. And then when we select someone new with a story, we just kick them to the curb. And there's no support for them. I've also seen homeless people and formerly homeless people go from a park or an RV all of a sudden to the spotlight, to where they're, celebrated. There's no support for them. And it has negatively affected people.
Yes.
And I could see, whether it be egos or self-esteem or whatever, all of a sudden you're nothing. I mean, you're literally nothing. You're spit on by society.
Yeah.
And now you're at the mayor's house.
Yeah.
And you're talking to a group of people, right? That not everybody's going to be able to make that transition in a healthy way. And I have seen it a couple of times in my own interactions with homeless people and formerly homeless people. One of the strongest, there was a homeless mom living in a van with her kids. And I was working aggressively to get her out of homelessness. And she had become pretty much a celebrity. This is back in change.org days. She was blogging. She was getting up there on social media and everything. And then I realized she was roadblocking the path to get out of homelessness, because then she wouldn't be a homeless advocate. And she was scared. What is that next step? And I'm just using that of one of many examples. And they're all a little different, but it's similar that we put people on a pedestal and we don't even think about how that affects them. And when the next story comes along that is a better story and we're going to have them go to the mayor's house and the other person is going, why am I not being invited to speak to the mayor's house? You invited me last time. And they're kicked to the curb. And you got to understand, I'm sorry, I'm bunching this all up. I got so much passion. The best value of a lived experience program is what it provides to the homeless person. Because many of them are isolated. They're in their apartment with absolutely nothing to do. And I'm speaking at the mayor's house.
Yeah.
I'm going to conference on Capitol Hill Day, which is a dog and pony show. It's complete bullshit. But when homeless people tell me I'm going to see Congress, I'm like, I don't say what I think. I'm like, great, you're going to have a fun time. And they're like, oh my God, I made a difference, right? And that is the value of a lived experience program. But we never consider that. We just, what can we suck out of these people by having a lived experience committee?
Okay.
Did I tee you up?
Oh, a little bit. So you've talked so much about people with lived experience and the advisory groups and the conferences and that sort of stuff. If you were a homeless service provider, what would you need to get out of someone with lived experience?
Well, first, I would look at the lived experience program, which is something the homeless sector doesn't do, is what is the value to the people participating? I mean, there is value to the homeless sector, although I will say there's nothing a homeless or formerly homeless person can say that hasn't been said before.
Right.
So we're not listening.
Right.
But we need to also look at how a lived experience program or scholarship gives homeless people purpose. And that purpose, I mean, taking somebody to Congress where they're going to speak in front of a staffer, because you rarely get the actual politician.
Right.
You know, whether it influences change or not in our political system, it influences the self-worth and self-esteem of that formerly homeless person or homeless person. And to me, that is the biggest value. There is value in what lived experience programming gives to the homeless sector, but what's overlooked is the value lived experience programming gives to the homeless or formerly homeless person.
Yeah, I think you're bang on in terms of purpose and perhaps even some hopefulness, right? That if I can do this, what else am I capable of doing?
Right. I was out on the streets and now I'm giving back and helping.
So part of it was bringing back a memory. I have had the experience of working for someone who constantly wanted success stories, right? You got to feed the machine. Feeding the machine was elected officials, funders, general public. Like, they got to know. And a lot of this happened in the early days when the people said, like, we need to know early successes. And so the memory I have is of one of the guys we featured bawling in my office that he lost his housing and feeling like he had let us down. And so that idea of a pedestal and the crash that can happen, I think those feelings of failure are huge. And again, I'll go back to, we try to manufacture the story that we want people to hear rather than telling the general public or elected officials or funders the real reality.
Yeah.
To that point, I do think we've seen some national organizations do a good job trying to lift up people's voices in a supported context. And so I don't want us to throw out the opportunity to learn from people's realities, but it's got to be an open invitation to everybody, and the supports have to be there. So that I'm not just handpicking the stories I want to tell, that everybody has a story and they're just as valid, even if yours is more traumatic or than another person's, et cetera, that they're all adding value. And then I think of organizations that have truly been empowered by having a voice. There's an organization in the Toronto area. They're called the Dream Team. And they're basically people who have had interactions with the mental health system, many of whom have also experienced housing instability or homelessness, who speak about that journey. But they have worked as a collective. So there's peers helping peers with professional supports, helping them over a period of time, and very impactful stories. But that is still so very different from the reality that we're seeing in so many communities now, Mark, where it isn't a come all tell your story. It's not supported, and it is putting people on a pedestal. And when people are on a pedestal, there's also the issue of essentially being told that you can do no wrong, right? And so I've seen this on several boards now, where someone with lived experience is brought onto the board, or living experience is brought onto the board, and their behaviors at the board meeting are not aligned with either the culture of the board, the bylaws of the board, the identity of committees, those sorts of things. And instead of the same sort of accountability that I have for another board member who might act that way, I come up with the excuse and say, we can't have that hard conversation because they're a person with lived or living experience. So we start very much a patronizing approach to how we engage people, a very condescending approach. But it can also lead to dysfunction on boards and those sorts of things when we're not holding everybody accountable in the exact same way. So I really think if we're going to do this right, so let's get at some of the solution parts of this, but if we're going to do some of this right, we have to think through what does a peer support truly look like for people providing peer supports. That's one. Two, we have to look at how do we marry expertise of someone who, let's say, has great technical knowledge of how funding works and regulation works with someone with lived experience. Like, how do we marry those things together as opposed to saying one is awesome and the other one is bad, or one is awesome and the other one is boring or invaluable? And I also think that in telling those stories, we as a sector have to be willing to listen to people that have alternate views of their experiences, right? So listening to people with living or lived experience who are critiquing our programs. I mean, this is where I say value and advisor groups. Like if you were redoing the standards of your shelters or your policies and procedures, by all means, get a bunch of people who have gone through your shelter or a bunch of people in your shelter right now to read your policies and give you feedback. Like you're going to get no more honest answer than that, but get lots of it. Get like a whole group of people together, give them some food and some resources, and give them a scribe who will take notes of what they're sharing, who's not affiliated with your organization, but whose total job is just to write down the things that they're hearing and feed it back to the group. That can add tons of value. You want to develop a new program, right? Let's say a housing support program for people for whom Housing First has not worked. Well, let's get a bunch of people for whom Housing First hasn't worked and ask them, what didn't you have that you needed? That has tremendous value.
Huge.
And is remarkably important. But it's back to when I ask you to do something you have neither the skills nor experience, and I thrust you into this other job and say, you must be able to figure this out, or you're going to be entirely fine, or, just tell me if you need any supports. That's not the same as supporting people through a process to really leverage the gift that they can provide from a perspective that some people just don't have.
Yeah. Well, we've seen now lived experience being so, sexy that they're giving them, funding and a management of some kind of homeless program.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be generic on purpose to not throw somebody under the bus.
Yep.
But they don't get the training, and it's just, they're formerly homeless people. They should know how to run it. Here's a couple $1 million. Let's let them run it. And that's crazy. It's like getting a group of people together and saying, okay, we want you to fly this plane. We're not going to give you a manual or any training, or you can't even talk to this pilot, but you have lived experience of homelessness, so you should be able to flap your arms and fucking fly. Notice how I'm like turning into you.
Yeah.
You used to talk like
I
this.
did. I just, reversal. Okay. So There are multiple communities that I have worked with and or I'm aware of where we've got to the point where people with lived experience have been supported in developing their own not-for-profit organizations. And I will say there could be huge value in that. But once the not-for-profit is established, then they receive no support after the fact. And so they're left to defend for themselves when it comes to things like grant applications. Well, there's a reason why really big nonprofits have a full-time grant writer on staff and a whole bunch of fair to middling sized nonprofits outsource when it comes to writing grant applications because they're hard, right? Yeah. Depending upon the funding source, they can be a royal pain in the butt. And so when you have these organizations who are not equipped to write good grant applications, and then they're saying, but you didn't fund us. And the funder, I mean, goodness gracious, being in a position where if ever there was an audit and then we knew that application got funded, there would be hell to pay. Yeah. Right? It's not defensible. Yeah. So leaving these organizations to fend for themselves, I think is just infuriating people with lived experience, one. But it's also setting people up to, again, say, you've got to be beholden to the system as opposed to you've got to be supported to be part of the system.
Yeah. My favorite story as a token COC representative, right? Because the COCs mandate that there has to be 2 people with lived experience.
Yep.
So which is funny because these meetings are pretty much equivalent to a root canal. So, the chief of police, the library director, homeless service providers, they have to go.
Yeah.
And they understand some of the conversation.
Yeah.
Most homeless people do not, and
Nope.
They're not compensated or given a stipend. But I was the token COC person, and I remember they're referring to each client as a number.
Mm-hmm.
So they're saying 678-157. He was outside a 7-Eleven. He just got divorced. His leg is still swollen. They're giving all this identifying information, but his name was a number. And I stopped and I said, is that their HMIS number? And they went, yes. I go, why are you referring to him by a number? And they said, because you're in the room and you're not approved to know his name. And I just, he hangs out by 7-Eleven, his leg's swollen. And I went through all this identifying information. And then I said, in Nazi Germany, they assigned people numbers. How dehumanizing that is that you assign people a number instead of calling them by their God-given human name. That was my last meeting there. I remember one other time they had a data point that in 6 months, 50% of people left housing. And they were celebrating. We got this new data point. We got this. And I'm not a data person.
Correct.
You're very much a data person.
I'm nerdier than you are.
You're by far. And I went, raise my hand.
Yes.
You guys, do you realize that 50% of people leaving housing is not a good thing?
Right.
And they're like, but we got a new data point. And I was like, what bullshit this all is. Just,
Yeah, and I think in this space, first of all, I think it's important for listeners and viewers to know that in these continuums of care, that's what COC stands for, they're really trying to run the ship, if you will, at the local level when it comes to homelessness response. And I would say probably lots of value we could get from people with lived experience, maybe even more so than living experience in that space, right? If we knew how to champion it. But when it gets to the dehumanizing, and I think there are privacy protections, but again, it would get at some people are authorized and some people are not. Well, why is that? And what would it take for all of us to be authorized or for us to have a completely different anonymizing way of having the conversation so it's level playing field for everybody? I don't think there's maliciousness necessarily when it comes to protecting people's information, but you're right. if I say I'm keeping the name away from you, but I'm going to describe their location, their physical features, etc., you could put two and two together
Yeah.
and absolutely figure it out
This
who
was
it is.
a town that had 8 homeless people.
Well, then you had a good chance of being able to figure this out. But I think overall, when we are getting people with lived or living experience to engage, there's going to be this danger, which is they are intimately familiar with some of the people most impacted by whatever is being discussed. Yeah. And I don't think, again, to the supports, that there's an adequate amount of supports for people to say, you could actually be a voting member of an entity that is going to strip away funding from another program or another organization that is going to impact the lives of whether it's 10, 50, 100, 300, 500 people experiencing homelessness. The weight on the shoulders of people who are going through the process of homelessness to know that they're taking away. I mean, if you think about how much street code there is and street culture there is when someone gets housed, and think about all the people that they left behind and all the people that they owe a debt of gratitude for and all the people that they loved and supported during their homelessness. That's why they invite people to come and stay at their place and those sorts of things. And now saying, and you could be the deciding vote to take away $1 million from another organization. That is just an enormous gravity on the shoulders of someone who is lived their life, at least for a period of time, through a scarcity lens as opposed to an abundance lens. And I don't think that's fair to the people that we're supporting. So we really have to figure out even context of engagement. We do have to figure out ways of, also not equating one person's experience to all people's experiences. We do that a lot in the empathy realm. We say you shouldn't be able to say, like, just because you recovered from alcohol addiction, let's say that someone else's experience of alcohol recovery would be the same. Both could find it beneficial, but you could have multiple journeys getting to the same endpoint. My other fear with when we have just the token voice of lived experience is we assume that way is the only way. You know who else uses lived experience or living experience really well? Our elected officials, though. Tell me if you've ever heard this, Mark. Let's say a mayor going to an event to speak, and they'll say something like, well, I was just talking to a guy yesterday, and he told me X, Y, and Z. And now I'm going to apply X, Y, and Z and assume that is the story and the reality for everybody. And for service providers in the room, policymakers in the room, researchers in the rooms, people at the system level in the room, it can sometimes be head shaking to say, how can an elected official take that one voice in that 1 5-minute encounter and use it to trump all of the expertise and energy that we have put in to creating a different policy or a different plan or a different program? Like, it is astronomically mind-blowing.
Well, as promised, we said we would talk about some good stuff, people implementing. I know I was bragging about Hennepin County. Their lived experience was integrated into everything they did, from outreach to housing, that people were involved in decision-making in a way that was productive and not tokenism. Destination Home, I know, has a very well integrated. The best that I know of, and it's not homeless sector. Are you familiar with Howie the Harp and community access?
I'm not.
Oh my gosh. So Howie the Harp was a mental health advocate, homeless, busking Howie the Harp. And community access is an organization in New York City that by their DNA is 51% peers are employed. But to do that, because they're mostly mental health, you cannot ask somebody to be 9 to 5, nor can you have the normal job interviewing process.
Right.
So they had to change everything that they're doing. Community access. I spoke at an event with one of their PhDs who is a peer who is significantly suffering from mental illness, who went on to get a PhD because she landed there and they supported her through the process, and now she's on staff. She cannot work like normal people. Whatever normal people is, hardly normal.
Yeah.
See what I did there? You did me.
Totally did. Yeah.
And the one that I tried to get everybody to go look at is the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness.
Yes.
And what I love about what Tim did is early on, and I'm just talking about his events, because that is where lived experience is so I don't know if it's popular, but a lot of times, it's the events where you bring people in, you scholarship them to say, hey, we have a bunch of lived experience people here. What Tim does great, and I'm going to give an example. I've been to several of the events. This didn't happen at all of them, but this is the benchmark that they're striving for. So the first night is a gathering where a local nonprofit brings all the lived experience, both homeless and formerly homeless,
Yep.
to like a dinner with a band and a party, and people get to know each other because it's a strange environment. They
Sure
get to
is.
know each other. Then they took people and walked them through the conference facility before people are there, because many of them have never, to me and you, conferences,
They're just part of the job.
yeah, we're used to them, right?
Yeah.
It's an environment we're used to. Some are more political, some are, but you
More
navigate.
educational, yep,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yep.
But for somebody who has never been to an event, so they walk through, and then Tim had a green room. So because this is a strange environment, then they have social workers in the green room, and they have, food and sometimes music. And then the people with lived experience are also integrated in many of the panels and conferences, even speaking from the main stage. And it's a wonderful, and I don't know, Tim, if you're listening, forgive me for telling this story. I tell it in private, but I'm going to tell it publicly.
Here it goes.
One of my favorites was because in the green room, the people would organize. Mm-hmm. That was sometimes not good. So when you bring in a bunch of nuns, there's going to be challenges. Look at the American Congress, right? You can't just say, well, it's homeless people. If you bring in a group of humans, there's challenges. So they organized, and then they were protesting the conference.
Yeah.
I turned to Tim, we're watching, they're outside of the hotel, but they're protesting the conference. And I said, Tim, that's pretty impressive that you're allowing this to happen. And he says, I'm laughing because they're protesting the hotel and they all have a hotel room key in their pocket. And I don't know if our producer should put that story in there, but I've always loved that story because it shows that, you're allowing this group of people to really have a voice and go in direction that the group wants to go in. And what they're saying may be disruptive, but we have to disrupt what we're doing because it's not working as good as it could.
I think one of the great opportunities in creating these feedback loops with people lived or living experience is the ability to integrate that into conferences. I think that is wise. But I'd also say there's probably even greater value in integrating it in an ongoing way with an organization without even needing advisory groups, right? This is where technology, I think, is leveling the playing field of how people's voice is shared and what they want to say. I think that there's value, for example, in the likes of Pulse for Good, which are like these kiosks that people can be providing feedback on your programs on a regular basis. That's getting the voice of people with living experience on a regular basis in terms of what's working and what isn't working for them. I think advisory groups, really impactful. Yeah. I think that an advisory group at a conference, what is the content? What is the flow? How are we integrating people with lived or living experience into our conversation? Good advisors, right? So it's not other people judging and saying, well, this is what I think is best, even though I've never experienced houselessness in my life. And then there's concerns that still persist in all this. I had this recent encounter just a couple of weeks back, being in a meeting, and someone with lived experience said, how would you know you're just a consultant? And I tried to empathize and said, I don't know your reality, but I do try to go to great lengths to understand and empathize and be engaged with people on a regular basis to understand. And any experiences I might have had in my life are decades ago, right? I don't pretend that some of the mistakes of my youth that I like to think made part of the beauty of my age are as relevant now as perhaps they once were. But I'm also not ready to give up and say, just because you have living or lived experience, that I am somehow just a consultant with nothing to add or value. So again, I'll go back to, we need multiple voices to be heard. We probably need multiple channels to hear that voice. We need to blend it with experience and expertise of people who aren't in the throes of their houselessness or homelessness and haven't experienced it recently, for sure. And we also need to get to a place where we say, how do we lift these voices up so that it's not just more poverty pornography, but it actually moves the needle on policy, programming, and resources. Yeah. Like, that is where it's got to be. And if we don't have that aim clear from the beginning, then I fear it's kind of like, oh, the board, that was the first time they'd ever heard from someone with lived experience. I'm going to say there's lots of ways board members should get that, not just by having someone with lived experience on the board, right? Yeah. Or you have these events, which I agree with you. Events are amazing places to get people with lived or living experience involved. Absolutely huge and critical. But it shouldn't be the only place where we're hearing that. And so this kind of multiple perspective, I mean, I think even in the space of the YouTube that I am learning more about, there's lots of people with lived and living experience who have their own channels.
Yeah. So there was a lived experience conference.
Yes.
And they asked me to speak.
Right.
So I thought I was speaking to formerly homeless and homeless people.
Who were you speaking to?
Well, they changed it up on me, but I did a presentation that has not seen the light of day. So there's a woman on TikTok. Her name is Court. She's at influencer level. I haven't looked in a while, but last I looked, she had 400,000 followers on TikTok. Several documentaries. She's TikToking while she's living in a homeless shelter. She did a TikTok, I got to play it for you, that's so brilliant. She rated all her psychotropic medicines.
Wow.
She said, I took this, I took trazodone, and this is what it did to me.
Yeah.
And then I took this. I mean, just brilliant, right? She does a rant about violence in shelters that is just perfect. Do you think the homeless sector even knows of her? No, they don't. We got to listen to homeless people. Here's a woman, a young woman, who is known to the general public. The other one is, I have a friend who is also on TikTok. She has mental illness. I won't say her name. And she just does it because it's like journaling.
Yeah.
She's not trying to do advocacy.
No.
She's not trying to do, it just makes her feel good, like somebody's listening, right? And then there's Addie, who is my homeless friend. And she is also on TikTok. She does a live every night where she's educating the public. There's homeless people out there right now.
Yeah.
Right? Using platforms like YouTube and TikTok that we could help them, right? But we don't. We have this idea of what a lived experience person is. And you brought up we've got to wrap this. Our producers are giving us the sign.
Got it.
So they're not really giving us the sign, but
right. Yeah, I understood.
Yeah. I think we're at that time. I run an online support group. It's evolved over the years. And what I've done is, it's not, like I say, I facilitate it, but it's not my group. Everything in the group is public. So if, like, we have had people that are intoxicated or with mental illness, and we give them second, third, fourth, fifth chances. If they continue to do personal attacks, because the only rules are no personal attacks, no racism. No personal attacks, racism. Rest is all there. And we try to help people. And we give them chance upon chance upon chance. But if somebody has to be removed, it's rare, but it does happen. We explain it to the group, and the group makes the decision. Because I've lived in homeless shelters, and decisions were made that I was like, why did they do that? And it was never explained to me. So our group has run that. Then we have moderators, some of them with lived experience, who are on different time zones. So if there's something that happens in the group that somebody is melting down, needs help, that there is somebody that's paying attention.
Wow.
That is always there. We have 2,000 members. Occasionally, I've been able to help people, but they lived in Los Angeles.
Right.
And it's a peer support group. So like when, service providers are closed, there's always somebody there, right, they can run to. If I was a service provider, you could do that because your outreach is going to take time off. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
But you could have homeless people helping homeless people 24/7. And because it's hyper local, you would be able to help these people. But nobody does it. They don't see the value of how digital inclusion saves lives and saves people money. But speaking of saving, let's save digital inclusion for the episode where we're talking about AI.
All right. There's one more thing I want to talk about on this episode just before we wrap up, which is this. I think invisible people was really misunderstood and threatening to a lot of people who worked in the sector in the early days because it was seen as providing an outlet and a voice to people experiencing homelessness in a way that no one understood why you would do such a thing. Why would you? Like, what's the point? What's this guy's angle? What is he trying to prove? What is he trying to get? Is he really going to build an entire profile, on Twitter, X, other social media channels, YouTube for sure, that is just based upon people's living experience and their unfiltered ability to tell their story?
Over 1,000 interviews, raw and unedited.
And that freaked people right out, myself included. And I'll tell you why, Mark. Because so many of us are taught that there's a right and a wrong way to use, whether it's digital media or whether it's to just engage with people. And you seem to violate and not just grab the third rail, you were like humping it and saying, this is where it's at. Like, this is the grind of, that all sounded sexual. Let me back up.
Yeah.
The thing that you did, Mark, was you grabbed the third rail and you said, I am going to give these unedited voices a megaphone. And I'm going to let sometimes even their family members know, not because you contacted the family members, but because they essentially appealed to the masses and built reconnection. It doesn't mean that you ever had an alternate agenda. But the thought that you would enter into the space of giving people a voice and leveraging that voice of people with living experience was enough to upend the apple cart, I think, in ways that has taken us a long time to realize that if not you, then people themselves. If not you, then someone who wouldn't have a motive that was perhaps much more pure and certainly probably would have been much more debilitating. Don't get me wrong. There's times when you've done interviews and I've watched some of the footage and I'm like, I need to know in my heart of hearts what happened to that person afterwards, right? Especially when people are outpouring. But there's also a sensitivity that you've had, a gentleness that you've had when you can tell people are not doing particularly well and you see the comfort that there's an empathetic voice that's attached to the camera. Yeah. So I think in the space of amplifying voice of living experience is probably nothing better than invisible people in terms of an unfiltered look at it.
It fits in the topic here, but we could go on to a third or fourth episode at some point on this because I have developed tips and protocols the best that I could to make sure nobody gets hurt. And one of the first pushbacks that you get from program people is that they're fighting for that person's privacy. And I understand that. The marketing people should be fighting for the story. Programs people should be fighting for privacy. That is a healthy tension because with that tension, you'll make sure that nobody gets hurt. So I have hard drives filled of interviews that I've done that I would never air. That's what is the difference between invisible people and some of these YouTubers now that are making money exploiting homeless people. Yeah. And I know that it would get millions of views because that person has a mental illness or they said something sensational that would get views. But I am not going to air it because the number one thing is people first.
Well, yes.
It is people first. So at the very foundation, and I can go into, how I developed this years after years. But one of the things that I've always tried to say to programs people, the number one thing you can give to someone is your positive attention. Mm. So when you come up to somebody who has no influence, if you would, right? They're homeless, they're spit on by society, and you empower them to share their own story, it can be life-changing, and we've seen it. So there's a girl on the Strand in London. Don't know how much you've done in London. I'm sure you've been there a million times.
Not a million.
In a wheelchair, yeah. She's in a wheelchair. Her name is Louise. Heartbreaking story. She sent me an email with a picture of her now saying, thank you for noticing me all those years. Right? There's a homeless woman who I still talk to that I interviewed that had a catheter. She was on Hollywood Boulevard. She's blind now, but she's in housing.
Awesome.
And she is so grateful. And there's actually a gentleman that was on Hollywood Boulevard that went and watched his video. I know this twice, that went and changed they saw themselves and went, oh, I'm going to change my life. And they've been empowered. There's a wife of someone that I interviewed recently that just texted me 2 days ago that says, we still hear about Luke's video all the time in an encouraging way, right? And if it was not in an encouraging way, I would remove the video, right? Because of that. But the homeless sector, to your point, thought they only want success stories.
Yeah.
But it's that voice of people that lived experience. And what I did, one of the early things is I was going, well, the homeless sector's sharing all these success stories. Let them do that. I'll tell this other story that nobody's telling. And I know from my television background that is what are going to resonate with people.
Yeah. I think back to what's a healthy way?
Yeah.
Right? Let the people speak. And then to kind of borrow the phrase that has happened in so many kind of consumer-driven groups is that the whole idea of nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
Don't go out there and telling the stories of homelessness without those voices, but make sure the voices are more inclusive. And I think that's just what you've done so well, Mark.
Well,
So
thank you. We've gone long.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
People could have stopped listening a long time ago.
But we're probably going to do this on a regular basis if we can.
You and I just sharing our thoughts on what different topics and what's going on. I love it,
Oh,
Mark.
Lord, help us.
Well, let's help everybody.
If you like this podcast or any of our content, documentary films, daily news articles on homelessness, please visit invisiblepeople.tv/donate and give a gift of any size. Our work has never been more important, and we cannot continue without your help.